Okay, lecture 5. Today we're going to be talking about the joints of the body, and we'll be talking about the components that make up a joint, and then also the various classification of joints that we have. So the rigid elements of the skeleton meet at joints or articulations. Joints are considered the weakest portion of our skeleton, but the good news about our joints is they enable us to resist tearing, crushing, and they're what allows us to have the movements that we have. Without our joints, we wouldn't be able to complete the complex movements that we can. The Greek word ortho means joint, so arthrology is the study of joints. And so we'll be looking into that in a little bit of detail here in this lecture. So in terms of the types of joints that we have, the articulation, again, of 2 or more bones allows us to have various types of movement. So we can classify our joints based on their structural arrangement and then also based on their function and what types of movements are allowed at that particular joint. So our understanding of how the joints work and how different movements occur will be really important for us when we get into studying the different muscles and the joints that each of those particular muscles will cross. So again, the extent and type of movement determine the name that is applied to the joint. So bone structure limits the kind and amount of movement at each joint. And articulations, like I said, can be classified in 2 different ways. We can classify them structurally and then also functionally. And in terms of their functional classification, we're talking about the types of movements that can be allowed at those particular joints, or the number of movements. So in terms of the functional classification of joints, there are really 3 different types. We have synovial joints, which functionally are basically immovable. And there are a couple of places in our body where we have these synovial joints that are basically 2 bones fused together. And again, the idea behind the synovial joints, or these kind of sutured joints, is that there's not a lot of movement, but we can acknowledge that they were initially 2 separate bones, and now they're completely fused together. The second functional classification of joints is amphiarthroidal joints. And these types of joints are slightly movable. So they have a small amount of movement, but not a whole, large amount of movement through a range of motion or anything else like that. The third classification of joints, and what we most commonly think about when we're talking about functional classification, is the diarthroidal joints. And these are freely movable joints. And the diarthroidal joints will be what we're really focusing on when we talk about our muscles and the joints that each of those muscles cross, and how that relates to muscle function and movement. So again, each of these functional classifications is named based on the amount of movement that they do allow. We can also classify joints based on their structures. And so these joints are based on the material that binds the bones together in the presence or absence of a joint cavity. Okay, so there are 3 structural classifications that we have for these various joints. One being fibrous, second being cartilaginous, or with cartilage, and the third being synovial in nature. And again, if we think about the joints that are highly functional and moving in a large range of motion and with several different types of movements, these would be our synovial joints and also the diarthroidal joints if we were to functionally classify them. And again, that's kind of where we'll spend most of our time talking, is with most of the synovial joints that we have. Okay, so let's start with our synovial. joints. And again, these are immovable in nature. They're fibrous joints. And there's, like I said, a couple instances where we have these. And a suture actually means the word seam. And sutures can be found in our cranial bones. And they are immovable joints or synovial joints beyond infancy. So when you're born, you have these fontanelles, which are kind of like a little soft spot in your head, and that's the gaps between these cranial bones. And during infancy, these bones become fused together and form these sutures. And again, a suture is an immovable joint. And we have several different sutures within the skull itself, and we'll talk about these in lab when we get into the identification of different bones and bony landmarks. But these sutures are basically the seams that connect those cranial bones. Okay. Synovial joints, or again, these immovable joints. The other instance where we have these immovable joints is gomphosis, which is basically like the sockets of your teeth. And you can see here that gomphosis actually means peg in a socket, which I think is kind of interesting. And if anybody's going into dentistry in this class or considering dentistry, you can see these, how this is would be very important for people in that field to understand how this particular joint works. And it's kind of weird, I think, to think about our teeth really being a joint, but that's what they are. And you can see that the tooth itself, if we consider it a bone, I guess, is connected through these periodontal ligaments into this kind of socket-like configuration. Okay. Another example of these immovable joints, or the synovial joints, is a syndesmosis, and this is when bones are connected exclusively by ligaments. So we have bands of fibrous tissue that are longer than those that occur in sutures. And you can see here we've got an image of the... Okay, sorry about that. You just heard my two dogs. It is Saturday afternoon, and every time the mailman comes to my house, they think they need to bark at him and protect the house, I guess. So anyway, those are my dogs. Okay, so back to the synovial syndesmosis joint. So again, it's like a fibrous tissue that connects these two bones together. So right here, what we're looking at is the fibula and tibia. So these are the two bones of your lower leg. And again, we'll talk in much more detail about these two bones in lab next week. But basically they are two separate bones, but they're connected by this fibrous tissue, and that allows them to really have all their movements together. So even though they're not fused together, they are connected by fibrous tissue, and that allows them to basically have all their movements together. They don't do anything separate. Okay, so we're going to talk about the amphiarthroidal joints next. And again, these are slightly movable joints. And this is going to be made of a cartilage structure. And like I said, slightly movable in nature. And we've got the synchondrosis joint. And that's going to be separated by hyaline cartilage. So again, you can see here that we are connecting the ribs to the sternum via a costal cartilage, which is made up of hyaline cartilage, if you wanted to look at the tissue type itself. And we have very limited amount of movement at this particular joint. We can have, as you take a big breath in, You can feel the expansion of your rib cage, so they will allow, just a slight amount of movement, but they're not having a whole lot of movement. They're very little or very limited in terms of the amount of movement that will occur here. Other types of slightly movable joints would include epiphyseal plates, and our epiphyseal plates are the same as our growth plate. So that's kind of interesting. As a child, or until you are finished with puberty, you've got these epiphyseal plates, which are going to allow you to basically have bone growth at that particular area. Okay. Moving forward, now we're going to be talking again about some slightly movable joints. One other instance or one other place in our bodies where we have this slightly movable joint is the pubic symphysis. And this is fibrocartilage. We talked about that in the tissues lecture, when we talked about the 3 different types of cartilage that we have. Fibrocartilage was one of the specialty types of cartilage. And the job of fibrocartilage, again, is to resist tension, compression, and shock absorption. And so you can see here in the green, this is the actual pubic symphysis here. And what it's basically doing is connecting the 2 pubic bones, which are here. And again, very slightly movable. In this particular location, I'm sure you can understand why we wouldn't want to have movement at this particular location. And so this fibrocartilage, which is made of a lot of our fibrous types of proteins or fibrous collagen fibers, you could say, very strong in nature. This is going to provide strength, but also provides a little bit of flexibility. And again, the only major time where we want to actually have movement of this particular joint is when a woman is going into childbirth. We would like to have a little bit of more mobility here so that we can kind of open up that birth canal and the baby can come through with a little bit more ease. Okay, moving on to our synovial joints, or our diarthroidal joints, and these are our freely movable joints. And these are the joints, again, that we most commonly think about when we would just commonly think about the word joint in general. And this is, again, what allows us to have movement within the body. So what are the components of a diarthroidal or synovial joint? There are several different things. So we have articular cartilage, which you can see in the blue, and that is made up of hyaline cartilage, if you were to think back to the tissues lecture. And that's going to provide a kind of a smooth surface on the bone ends so that when those bones actually interact, there's not a like overbearing amount of friction. It provides kind of a smooth surface for the bones to slide across each other. We actually have a joint cavity as well, an articular capsule. So the capsule itself provides like basically a joint filled cavity. And within that particular capsule or within that particular joint, we have what's called synovial fluid. And you can see does it show synovial fluid? No, it doesn't show exactly synovial fluid, but the fluid kind of fills in this area and it provides us with basically like a cushioning mechanism for the joint itself. So that synovial fluid can kind of move as the joint moves. And again, it just kind of allows, it's kind of like a little pillow in there, and it kind of allows us to absorb some of the shock. And again, we want to prevent having bone-on-bone interaction, so it can help reduce that friction. Also, within a freely movable joint, we need to have reinforcing ligaments. So if this is the knee joint, there are really 4 different ligaments that we have that are going to help to reinforce this particular joint. And basically, it prevents the joint from becoming dislocated, and it will limit the joint's ability to have movement in any plane. Again, it's just a protective mechanism that's going to help us to keep that joint in place. So within the knee, for example, like I said, we have 4 different ligaments that are going to help with this. The amount of ligaments within the joint can vary depending on the bone structure, depending on the muscle structure, and depending on several other factors. And we'll talk about that on a joint-to-joint basis once we get into the lab information. Lastly, the synovial joints will also include nerves and vessels. So again, nerves are going to provide us with some sensory feedback. So it's going to give us information in terms of, whoa, we're stretching this joint too far. We've gone too far out of our range of motion. It can also provide us information about pressure that's going on in the joint. So again, if you're putting too much pressure on the joint, that can cause some sort of signal to be sent. It can also provide us with feedback in terms of inflammation within the joint as well. And we'll talk about those factors again as we move into the nervous system. We also have vessels within the joint itself. Our synovial fluid is a very active type of fluid, so it's got, different nutrients and other things involved, and so we need to make sure we're keeping that synovial fluid healthy, also that hyaline or that articular cartilage healthy. Again, the joint, just like a lot of the other organs within the body, is a very active area, so we need to make sure we're providing it with nutrients and also getting rid of waste. Again, like we just mentioned, our articular covers are made of a hyaline cartilage that's going to cover each ends of the bone. Okay, so it covers each end of the opposing bones. Acts as a cushion to help absorb compressive forces. It's also smooth in nature, and the reason for that is it's going to help to reduce friction when these bones have an interaction with each other. The joint cavity or synovial cavity, again, is a place that holds the synovial fluid. Again, we said the synovial fluid is kind of like a pillow. It's dynamic. It's easy to move around, and again, its job is to kind of keep things a little bit less intense and help to absorb some shock. The articular capsule itself has 2 layers. The outer layer is a fibrous capsule, and this provides strength for the joint so that the bones are not pulled apart. And we have an inner layer that is synovial membrane, and its function is to make that synovial fluid. And again, that fluid kind of serves as, like we said, like a little bit of a pillow and help with absorption. Okay, so looking at the synovial fluid here, again, like we said, it's a viscous liquid inside of the joint cavity. Viscous means it's kind of like thick in nature, so it's kind of like a thick gel-like liquid, you could say, kind of like jelly, I would compare it to. And it's got 2 major functions. The first function is to provide nourishment. So it contains a lot of what we call glycoproteins. And glycoproteins are a sugar and protein combination. It's a molecule that, like I said, contains both sugar and proteins. So it's going to help with providing us with nutrients, but then also providing us with protein, which would help us with repairs. And its second function would be to help lubricate the joints. So again, the 2 functions of this synovial fluid would be to provide us with nourishment and to lubricate the joints. Okay, so we have these reinforcing ligaments, and these are made from thickened parts of the fibrous capsule. And ligaments can be extracapsular or intracapsular. So what this means is they can be within the capsule, and that's intra, or they can be outside of the capsule, outside of the joint capsule, and that's extracapsular. So of the knee, for example, we have two extra capsular ligaments, and those would be the LCL, or lateral collateral ligament, that runs on the lateral side of your knee, and the MCL, which is the medial collateral ligament, runs on the inside of the knee. We have two internal ligaments as well, or intracapsular ligaments within the knee. One is the ACL, or anterior cruciate ligament, and the other is the PCL, or posterior cruciate ligament. And again, those take place within the fibrous capsule itself. And again, we'll talk in more detail about the specifics of each joint once we get into the lab. So don't worry about that right now. Okay, so in terms of these synovial joints, nerves, and vessels, synovial joints are richly supplied with sensory neurons. Again, like we said, they can send all sorts of sensory information back up to the brain regarding the position of the joint itself. And again, its major job is going to be to help us monitor the joint stretching. So if the joint stretches too far, it'll send kind of a cautionary signal up to the brain to say like, hey, we shouldn't be stretching this far. This isn't good. This doesn't feel good. This isn't a safe position for this particular joint to be in. Synovial joints may also include articular discs or menisci. So within the knee, for example, we have two menisci, and basically they're kind of like a little like half donut, I guess, and it basically just provides a little bit more stability for the knee in terms of keeping that joint in a safe position. And like I said, don't worry about the details of the knee, for example, right now. We'll talk about that in much more detail in lab here next week. We also can have bursa sacs and tendon sheaths within the synovial joint as well. And again, like I said, we'll talk in more detail about which specific joints contain these types of things once we move into the lab. This is just to kind of give you an introductory background about different types of joints. So again, what are the functions of the synovial joints? Again, synovial joints provide lubrication and allow joining bones to move with a little amount of friction. And again, we want to prevent this friction through having that cartilage at the edges of the bones, and we also are going to do that through having that synovial fluid in there. Again, that synovial fluid provides us with a slippery surface, which can help us overcome compressive forces. It's kind of like a jelly-like little pillow within the joint you could think of. And again, its job is to reduce friction and also to reduce the impact of a high amount of force. So what joint movements are allowed at synovial joints? Well, pretty much any movement that you can possibly think of is allowed at a synovial joint. And we're going to kind of subdivide these synovial joints and classify them based on which types of movements that they do allow. But basically, the type of synovial joint determines which movement occurs at that particular joint. So again, we can subdivide these synovial joints down a little bit deeper and look at the different types of movements that can occur at different joints. Okay, so with synovial joints, we have motion possible in at least one or more planes. So we've talked about those 3 planes of motion, and we'll talk about how that is related to the actual joint itself. So again, here are the 6, I guess, classifications in terms of those diarthroidal joints. Plane joint, saddle joint, hinge joint, pivot joint, ball and socket, and ipsiloid joint. And we'll talk about, like I said, these in more detail. And let's start with the plane joint. Okay, So the plane joint is going to allow short gliding movements, and movement may occur in multiple directions, generally a gliding movement. Because it allows only short gliding movements, they're considered non-axial in nature. So basically this means that there's no axis, there's just the sliding of the bones. So the bones just kind of move across each other. And right here we're looking at the bones of your hand, so they're the intercarpal bones. And again, I want you to just open your hand and try and like move those different joints. And it's really hard to have kind of an axial type of movement. You can see that it's very difficult to have any large amount of movement within these joints because we do have like 7 bones right here that are very small and very closely connected. So examples of plane joints include the intercarpal joints, which are these carpal bones or the bones of your hand, and also intertarsal bones, and the intertarsal bones are the bones of your foot. Okay. In terms of a gliding joint, again, you can see here it's very similar in nature to that of the plane joint. Again, gliding action. Okay, the hinge joint, you've got a bone that's kind of like a cylinder, and then also a trough-shaped bone. And we've got like a few different examples of these types of bones in the body. They're considered uniaxial. Uni means one, so like a unicycle has one wheel. So uniaxial means that it moves in one plane of motion. Examples of hinge joints within your body would be your elbow. So you can see this example, the image here is of your elbow. Also, your knee is considered a hinge joint, and your fingers are also considered hinge joints. So with these hinge joints, the major movements that we can have are flexion and extension. And again, we'll talk about joint movements in more detail on Monday once we get into our introductory lab, and we'll get to practice using these different types of movement, these different motions. Okay. So again, like we said, these hinge joints can have really 2 motions, and they're uniaxial, which means that they move in one plane of motion. And with a hinge joint, we can do flexion and extension. Okay, pivot joint. A pivot joint has one rounded end that fits into like a rung formed on the other bone, and the rotating bone turns around its axis. Again, uniaxial in nature. This moves in the transverse plane of motion. And I'm sorry, I forgot to say the hinge joint from before is going to move in the sagittal plane of motion. The sagittal plane of motion for our hinge, and our pivot joint is going to move in the transverse plane of motion. Examples of a pivot joint, the atlas and the dens of the axis. So that's the first 2 vertebrae that you have in the cervical region. So basically those 2 vertebrae have an interaction with your skull, and they allow us to shake our heads yes and shake our heads no. Okay, so those are both pivot joints. Other examples are the example shown here is the ulna and the radius. And the ulna and the radius are going to also allow for rotation. So we can rotate our ulna and radius around each other, and that allows us to do pronation and supination of our hand. So pronation and supination are a rotary movement, and they are completed through the pivot joint action of the ulna and the radius. Okay. Next up, we have the ipsiloid joint. and also called the condyloid joint, same thing. Basically, you've got one bone that's kind of like an oval, and the other one is kind of like concave. So the other one is like giving a hug to the oval, kind of. Or you could think of it as like a, I don't know, some sort of like trough, and then the oval shaped bone kind of like sits inside of it. So this is biaxial movement, so it allows movement in two planes. Bi means two, bicycle, two wheels. And so therefore we can move in both the frontal plane and the sagittal plane. So these types of joints can allow us for flexion and extension, and also abduction and adduction. Okay, flexion, extension, abduction, adduction. Okay, also called a saddle joint. Okay, so this fits in the same classification as the ipsiloid and condyloid joints. We just like to try and confuse you and have, multiple names for multiple things that are like really exactly the same. All right, so you've got a convex and concave surface that are going to interact with each other. So here you can see the thumb joint is a saddle joint. I'm pretty sure that's the only saddle joint that you have in your whole body. Again, biaxial, bicycle has two wheels. Biaxial can move in two planes. So we've got abduction, adduction, flexion, and extension. Okay, so same concepts that we just talked about with the condyloid joint. So again, this just shows you the movements of that saddle joint. So we have flexion, extension. This is abduction. Abduction, you're coming away from the midline, number 3. And number 4, adduction, so you're adding back in towards the midline. So those are all movements of the thumb, and again, two different planes, both frontal and sagittal plane. Okay. So next we can talk about the ball and socket joint. A ball and socket joint is got like a head or a ball, you could say, and it fits into another bone that's a round socket. Okay. Our ball and socket joints are multi-axial, so they can have movement in all 3 planes of motion. So they can have movement in the frontal plane, sagittal plane, and transverse plane. So they can kind of do like anything. Examples of ball and socket joints, we've really got 2 major ball and socket joints in the body. Your hip is a ball and socket joint, and also your shoulder is a ball and socket joint. Okay, so I want you to think about what are the major differences between the hip and shoulder ball and socket. Okay, if you think about what they actually look like, if you could just look at the bones themselves, you could tell me some major differences. So, and again, we'll talk about these next week in lab, but in terms of the structure or the bone configuration of the hip joint, we know that the hip has a much deeper socket. So, our leg fits into that hip socket much more, it's much more secure, I want to say. So our hip joint is a much more secure joint in comparison to our shoulder joint. The shoulder joint socket itself is much more shallow. And so oftentimes we hear of our shoulder becoming dislocated. And that's because the socket joint is very shallow in nature, and it can allow our arm to kind of get out of place rather easily. We don't hear much about hip dislocation. That would be a very rare thing to do, and part of that is because of the deepness, or the deepness, you could say, of that socket joint in the hip. So the hip is a much more stable joint in comparison to the shoulder, which makes sense. That's important to us because of the function. So the function of our hip is to bear the weight of your body. So it's really important for that to be a stable type of joint. Our shoulder doesn't have to bear the weight of our body very frequently. Probably never. I can't walk on my hands. I don't know if any of you can, but that's not a skill that I have. So you can imagine, the difference between their functions plays an important role in determining the bony arrangement and what's important for us there. Okay, so here you can see those bony differences. So here you can see the shoulder joint on your left here, and you can see that shallow configuration in terms of what we consider the socket there. When you look at the hip over here, you can see that this socket is much deeper, and therefore, like we said, that will provide us with much more stability in comparison to the shoulder. I want you to think for just a second about your range of motion at either joints. Where do you have a greater range of motion? In your shoulder or in your hip? I want you to put your arm down by your side and then lift it all the way over your head. Okay, you can easily, without even a question, even if you're not a very flexible person, be able to move your arm 180 degrees over your head. Okay, so the range of motion that we have in the shoulder joint is really great, actually, which is good news for us because we use our arms to reach things in high places and to manipulate different movements above our heads. So that's important to us. And again, the trade-off for a high amount of flexibility and range of motion is a decrease in stability. And that's exactly what we have in the hip. We have a larger amount of stability in the hip, but we have less range of motion. And so therefore, a lesser ability to complete kind of more crazy types of motions, you could say. So again, what are some of the factors that influence the stability of our synovial joints? The articular surfaces. So the shapes of the bones play a role in determining how well the bones fit together. Again, we talked about how some bones have a convex and concave surface and they kind of just fit together really well. Where other surfaces it's like who thought these bones should go together? They don't match up. They're not, it's not like a puzzle piece that would just fit perfectly together. So the articular surfaces and the shapes of those bones play an important role in determining how well they kind of fit together, which it's kind of weird to think about that way, but not all of our bones fit together perfectly like a puzzle. The ligaments play an important role in the stability. So ligaments help us to prevent excessive movement and provide us with some stabilization. So a joint that has a larger amount of ligaments would probably be more stable for us in terms of preventing injuries or preventing us from going too far in our range of motion. The third factor that would help us to determine the stability of the joint is muscle tone. So the contractile force can provide us with dynamic stability of the joint, whereas our ligaments provide us with really more of a static type of stability. Muscle tone is particularly important for us in our shoulder, knee, and also the arches of the foot. And again, we'll talk in much more detail about how muscle tone plays an important role in these particular areas as we talk in more detail about each of the joints of the body. But muscle tone will play an important role for us in terms of the stability of your shoulder and the stability of your knee. Okay, just a couple different terms in regards to some of the, I guess, issues that we have at our joints. Arthritis is a term that we've used to describe over 100 types of inflammatory or degenerative diseases that affect our joints. So if somebody says they have arthritis, they have some sort of issue with their joints, generally causing pain, stiffness, and swelling. Arthritis is one of the most common diseases in America. We usually don't have it at probably at the age that you are at, but possibly, your grandparents might have arthritis of their hip, or within their hands or something along those lines. Again, it's a very common disease that we see. Two types of arthritis that we'll just kind of briefly talk about in this class. Osteoarthritis is a degenerative joint disease. It's the most common type of arthritis, and it's a chronic type of disease, so it's kind of long-term in nature. And it actually affects 85% of aging Americans, which is crazy. That's almost everyone. 85% is a lot. The cause for osteoarthritis is unknown, and it is thought that it's maybe just related to the normal aging process. So basically, you get some thinning cartilage, and therefore you get cartilage fragments within the joint itself, and that can be pretty painful for us. Again, it's thought that maybe it's just a general part of our aging process, but we don't actually know if that's true or not. So again, kind of a cool thing in terms of we don't know exactly what's going on with this particular disease yet. Rheumatoid arthritis is a little less common, but it's a chronic inflammatory disorder. It's an autoimmune disease, so basically your body attacks the particular joints of the body. Again, it's very commonly seen within the hands, and again, it causes inflammation and deformities to these particular joints, and it can be a very, very painful type of disease to have.